So we ready to go? Anyway, I'd like to welcome everybody. Vicki Dahl, Chabin Concepts, and with me is Dr. Robert Eyler from Sonoma State University and president of Economic Forecast Analytics. He is going to share some information on the current economic situation that we are all in the midst of. And the end, we'll take your questions. We're in respect for your time, we're going to keep this to 30-40 minutes. If we are not able to get to all of your questions in that time, we will address them next week at the April 10 webinar that's going to start at 8:30, and we will be sending out another notice on that. Also, the webinars are going to be recorded and available on the Chabin website, www.chabinconcepts.com. So again, thank you everybody for being with us, and I'll turn this over to Dr. Eyler.
Thank you, Vicki. Thanks everybody for coming today. Use the chat functionality to ask questions, and Vicki will be back on after I'm done to tell you or to ask your questions, and then we'll wrap up. For the next little bit or so, I'm going to tell you about what I think as an economist is going on in the economy and where we're going to go for the next little bit. This is our agenda today. I'm going to talk about the economics of the situation we're in and where we may be going over the next few weeks. And then I'm going to switch gears a little bit and talk about municipalities and business and think about what's going to happen to our cities and counties over the next, let's say, 3 or 4 months and even over the next couple of years, and just things to watch for and the interaction of the business community's evolution in this crisis and its aftermath and how that's going to potentially affect our municipalities. And then finally, I want to talk about indicators for you to watch in terms of watching the turn of this thing, because it will turn, but there's also, depending on what scenario, as you're going to see in a minute, may play out, the turn may be slow versus fast. And a lot of that depends on the social policies we're facing and going to continue to face over the next few weeks. Here's where we were at the baseline. So every quarter, the Philadelphia Federal Reserve asks 40 economists what their thoughts are on real GDP or income growth after inflation, unemployment rates, and payroll job creation. And what I'm going to show you here is where we were as of January 31st, basically 2020. And the old forecast from the previous quarter was actually augmented in January to say that 2020 looked better than we thought it was going to look like just a quarter before. And you can see those numbers here. Hopefully you can see my arrow. You can see those numbers here. And then this was the annual forecast. So while this is kind of a cop-out forecast because every year looks like the same, the idea is that we've had no recession in the forecast and things look pretty good. And a lot of that was because the unemployment rate was looking like it was going to be very low right on through 2023. So no recession. And this is kind of the baseline. So when you hear the president, you hear economists talk about where we were before the crisis began, the American economy is in pretty good shape. Not amazing shape, but pretty good shape. So where we were on February 1 is we were creating jobs that were relatively low wage, but we were still creating them. The second is that we had consumer confidence relatively high, and your president felt like the election was basically a fait accompli, and the Democrats, while scrambling around a little bit, were not necessarily going to potentially win the election. I'll come back to that in a minute. This is where we were. Well, what happened? Well, what happened was the crisis that started in China and started to move through Asia began to move globally based on the way we're all linked in trade and the movement of people. And this is the evolution of cases in the United States on a logarithmic scale starting on February 15. And you can see here where a break took place. So things were sort of, let's say, optimistic about how the United States and its economy was going to react to the crisis. When this break took place and the slope of this line began to go up more quickly, that changed the pace of change. And you can see here, though, that when one sort of shining light is that this curve is beginning to top out a little bit. And assuming that the cases begin to top out as well, we'll see this curve continue to flatten over the next few weeks. If that happens, we might be at least getting close to the other side of this from an epidemiology standpoint, maybe not from an economic standpoint, but this is what started the movement down. The industries that were most affected were obviously travel and hotels. And so if your municipality or your place where you live and do business is highly connected to either an airport or related travel, including restaurants and retail, you're going to see a lot of negative activity probably in the next couple of months, simply because those industries, unfortunately, were the first to go in and will probably be the last to come out. And a lot of that's because we're concerned about reinfecting our communities once the social policies have ended. And that's going to continue to trickle through those industries over the next few months and potentially all the way through the end of this year. And I'll come back to that in a little bit. Consumer electronics, because China is the place where a lot of that's made, our ability to get the new iPhone or to have as much inventory around and make business decisions about our technology and our mobile technology may be somewhat slower than normal because of supply chain holdups in China. Places like Amazon that are focused on the delivery of goods and really just trying to get things to your home has had sort of an up and down movement through this crisis, but our supposition is that Amazon is going to gain from all this. So not only are these sometimes affected negatively, but Amazon should actually get more market share and potentially have more confidence in consumers on the other side of this thing. So we're watching that closely in terms of how many retailers locally, mom and pop style retailers, are threatened based on Amazon gaining more market share. Oil and gas has been through a real tumultuous time. It's likely that we're going to see oil and gas markets stabilize a little bit and start to spring back up. It sounds like a deal has been struck between Russia and Saudi Arabia that started gas prices and oil prices falling precipitously over the last few weeks. If that happens, then assuming our driving season renews itself once the social policies are lifted, we should see oil and gas come back. But it's been a real rocky time. And why that's important for the United States economy is because the middle of our country has a relatively large amount of resources built into both oil and gas and the industries connected to that. And as the gas price slowed down, it did put smaller employers in oil and gas very close to the edge. And we've seen some of the states from basically Minnesota south to Texas and sort of going out one state wide each direction along the Mississippi River be somewhat affected by the change in oil prices. Finally, consumer durables. And when you think about this, there's two connected parts here. One is on the side of, let's say, appliances for your home, how much renovation activity we're going to see in our cities and counties over the next few months and how that leads to appliance purchases and more sales tax revenue. Same with cars. That's the interest rates falling are going to feed some of potential buying movements over the next few months. But the key there is if they don't, then we're going to see a lot of flat movement in sales tax revenues over the next few months, but really going to see it's going to probably become because there's less movement in the economy and people being less confident about where we're going, and also construction not coming back at the same pace we expected. So those consumer durables are a big deal in terms of thinking about where we're going, because those are usually the types of goods that when we go into recession and stay there, consumers tend to pull back on buying new ones, but when they're confident, they tend to buy more new ones. And that's a trick right now, and see whether or not those industries sag on the other side of this issue. And ultimately, folks, in all these industries and all the industries that are around your places of business or your municipalities, labor markets are going to ultimately tell the tale. So a lot of what I'm going to tell you now to the end of today is going to be about labor markets. We're going to start with the S&P 500, however. And so when the industry started to shake, we started to see equity market movements. This is the month of March. So historically speaking, this graph I use in a lot of presentations because it's the monthly movement of the S&P 500. Here's the dot-com and the Great Recessions in historic contrast to where we've been just in the last 30, 40 days in the markets. So this is going to be a historic episode right here, as you can see in the shaded area in terms of equity markets. But let's look at those other two shaded areas briefly. I show you 735 is where where the S&P 500 bottomed out at the bottom of the Great Recession. That was about 50% off of the market peak previously, a little bit actually more than that. And we're not there yet. We're not even close to 50% down from the market peak. So while we are very, very concerned about our portfolios and whether or not this compares to the Great Recession or not, the reality is that we're still not in percentage terms close to the equity market depths we've seen. And the policies that we've put into place, the fiscal stimulus and monetary policy becoming more expansive, should help support equity prices medium term. It's still going to be a lot of rocking and rolling, but this graph has given people a lot of stomach aches. What's happened? Well, we've had monetary policy come in big, and I'll talk in a minute about historic comparisons, but we've seen a movement back down to the so-called zero lower bound, so interest rates are very low again. And we're likely to see a lot of management of the markets rather than, let's say, management of financial institutions over the next few months. Fiscal policy, big packages come out. A lot of us are scrambling around trying to figure out as employers if we can use these packages or not. We're going to see if that helps. But generally speaking, these two policies coming together in a positive fashion mean good things for the economy once the economy is set back again in demand. And these are both so-called demand side policies. They want to trigger more spending both by businesses and consumers. They're not meant necessarily to build the supply side of our economy back, but it should at least maybe, because of the way the fiscal policy is set up, help stave off some unemployment. But the real kicker here, folks, is our social policies. We've rarely in American history, and probably there is no good historic episode, seen a shutdown like this. And I said earlier I might give a historic parallel. If you think about the Great Recession, and that lasting about 18 months in time before we saw policy come in big, and we think about the time period right after 9/11, about a week where the American economy kind of shut down a little bit, travel shut down, our economy tried to sort out what was going to happen, let's say geopolitically as a result of 9/11. If you stack those two episodes on top of each other, you get pretty close to where we've been the last 40 days. And then you have all the policy happens within 40 days. So we basically went from the start of 2008 to the middle of 2009 with 9/11 stacked on top of it in terms of social policy, or let's say the social reaction to what's happened as an event. And that's a good way of thinking about what might be the best way of thinking about the turn. So I'll get to more of that in a second, but when you think about the historical episode, there is not one that makes sense. It's really the Great Recession compacted down from 18 months to about 40 days, and 9/11 stacked on top. So when we're thinking about stimulus and what we've got coming up, government sending direct payments to taxpayers, so folks are going to get checks in the mail. Unemployment benefits, those that actually go on unemployment and stay there now can be on there for 9 months, 6 months at the state level, generally speaking, and then 3 additional months. Some states are a little different, but not by much. The federal government is coming in and adding to those roles. Hospitals and healthcare have received a lot of stimulus, potentially about building more beds, building more facilities to help the crisis. Some larger companies are going to receive a bailout. That was the debate going on in Congress about should this be focused on small business only or on big business. There was a deal struck in between, but we're going to see some large companies, specifically airlines, probably get pretty good bailout money to bridge over the gap so we don't end up with just 2 or 3 airlines when this is all said and done. Small business for sure has folks with less than 500 employees, which tells you it's not all just small business. But a lot of small businesses are going to be able to get some relief. There's a complex web of possibilities out there. So please talk to your banker about SBA lending possibilities and what things can be done that are forgivable versus non-forgivable. We don't have time today to go into that entire matrix, but please be cautious and make sure it's a good plan for you before you jump into those programs. But the money is going to be there for you, especially if you're a small business with small margins. And then finally, the Federal Reserve is going to want to keep banks relatively stable. So you're going to see a lot of relief come into bond markets to make sure that we don't see a downturn in bond markets and really people fleeing only to cash, mainly because they're thinking about problems with their homes. So one of the biggest concerns we have as economists is that unemployment concerns will lead to business closure, which will lead potentially to another real estate crisis. And I'll come back to that in a minute when I talk about potential municipal effects of all these changes. But the Federal Reserve is very aware of the lessons we learned in the Great Recession and wants to stave some of the problems off, thinking that this may have similar effects in terms of how people look at their housing. Okay, so 2 words you should be very, very thoughtful about in terms of trying to predict how we're going to move through this is depth and duration. So we might have a very sharp downturn followed by a very quick comeback because the duration of the episode is shrunk in time. But the longer the social policies remain in place, and in a sense, the longer the issue has a shadow in terms of, well, I don't really want to lift the social policies completely because I'm worried about reinfection or those kind of concerns, especially in the big cities, the duration will elongate. And it may not be as deep because of the fiscal and monetary policies I just told you about, but the social policy duration may be one of the biggest problems we're going to have in our economy because we just can't get back to normal business based on what we're trying to do socially so we don't have healthcare completely overloaded with cases, which is the main reason why we're in the current social policies we have. What are some things to watch? Well, one of the things I've been asked a lot is to try to come up with scenarios as to what might happen. And of course, right now there's a lot of economists out there using, very hand-wavy crystal ball technology and not really using data because the data are not apparent yet as to what is likely to happen. We are starting to see more and more of those in terms of seeing unemployment insurance claims, which I'll talk about in a minute, and the policy changes. We kind of know those are in play. So I'm going to show you 3 scenarios specific to California because California is going to be, in a sense, a centerpiece of how to gauge where the economy is going. And the first scenario is a good one where we actually have that sort of short duration, quick movement, and then getting pretty quickly back to square where we thought we were going to be. And I'm going to show you a graph of what we're going to call non-farm employment levels as a way of gauging this. The next episode's a little more tricky, where the duration's longer, the depth's a little deeper, and we may actually see the shadow of this creep into next year, not because there's a second episode, but because the duration of unemployment and potentially the business failures that come on top of that have a little longer shadow than the good scenario, where we turn the corner quickly and people get back to demanding what they were going to do, and this becomes a very quick faded memory. The ugly scenario is the third one, and that's where we have a sharp decline, and it's followed by some comeback, but then there's a second episode later this year that leads to a similar but maybe shorter lived social policy. And then we maybe have a shadow of this all the way to 2023 or 2024, which is going to look a lot more like the Great Recession than, let's say, the dot-com recession in terms of the speed and the depth. And so that's some of the things we're going to watch here when I go through these episodes. Okay, here we go. So there's the last two recessions. Here is the movement and a potential forecast as a baseline. I'm on the California Department of Finance's forecast committee, and every year we get together to talk about the evolution of jobs in California. And this is through 2023. So this is the baseline forecast. Here's the good scenario as green. And you can see here on this side, this very short wobble in jobs against the baseline. So we see the downturn, and then we start to climb back up. And by mid-2021, we're basically back to where we thought we were going to be. The tricky scenario has us going out to 2022 because it's going to take the rest of this year to sort it out, next year to kind of get back moving again, and then 2022 to get back to square. And then the ugly scenario looks like this with the double dip and a very long run or longer run movement back to a baseline because we're sorting everything out. Now, if you look at the Great Recession in contrast, that was the dip during that sort of 2-year period where we were really in a wobbly economy. And where we're going potentially from the baseline is back to about 2015 job levels in the ugly scenario. So we'll lose about 5 years worth of job growth if the ugly scenario comes out in California, and ultimately as a reflection or a microcosm of what may happen in the US overall. That's something we're watching very closely because that means relatively large unemployment, that's sustained unemployment. Again, depth and duration. Now, one reason why we think that we're going to see at least a sharp episode is because of these numbers are starting to come out. There's our 3 recessions. This is from 1986 forward. And this number are new unemployment insurance claims on a weekly basis, but I use a 12-week average. It's very dangerous to say, oh, 9.9 million people walked into unemployment offices and asked for unemployment the last 2 weeks. Those folks might get a job again in 4 weeks or have some federal stimulus come in and help out sort of sort their unemployment situation to a certain extent for them. But here's the evolution, at least with a 12-week average. And there's still some sharp changes. Here's the US over all that time. And you can see on the far right-hand side here where we have a very sharp change in the US. And then there's California in red where I didn't take the seasonality out of it because it shows you the movement about every 6 or 8 months in California. But at the end, you can see the real sharp increase. Hopefully you can see that red and my arrow right here. That's following the US and in a sense feeding it a little bit. But the key is that we know we're going to get more unemployment. The bottom line is how much and for how long. And no one can tell you with certainty how that's going to play out yet. All we can sort of say is that the federal stimulus and monetary policy are meant to at least top off the major peaks that would have happened by being basically complacent and doing nothing. But this is the beginning of the issue in terms of labor markets. Okay. So if you're a municipality, what should you be looking at? And if you're a business, what should you be thinking about if one of the things you're concerned about is what's going to happen locally? Well, we should expect taxable sales to fall over the next couple of quarters because of a lack of flow of visitors, people not buying cars, manufacturing locally, not buying machines as fast, or let's say replacing machines as fast, which will reduce use tax, and just in a sense, a general reduction of what you can think of as taxable spending on non-essential items that otherwise would be happening. So we might be spending more at the grocery store, but generally those things are not taxable. And you'll be behind some taxable items. For example, if you stocked up on toilet paper, your municipality should thank you because you gave them a bunch of taxable sales you probably would not have done in the first place. But at some point, even that sort of trend is going to fade. And municipalities are going to see some taxable sales downturns probably at least through the next couple of quarters, hopefully not much more than that, but it might be through the end of the year. In terms of budgeting, please be thinking about that. And if you yourself are a retailer or a restaurateur or let's say maybe even a chamber lead, be watching your restaurants and your retailers very closely, and as well as your hoteliers, for getting close to the edge of being able to stay in business. And you may already have some folks that have reached out to you and said that it's just not going to happen and this is probably the end. We're likely to see construction slow down. So you may have a slowdown in permits, which means a slowdown in fees, and construction slowing down also has relatively wide economic impacts in municipalities. So watch for that too. The good thing about that is it may not add any more units to the housing market in the short term. It might slow down new units coming on if existing units start to go up because people are selling their houses out of concerns about the next move in our economy. We will see how that plays out, but that's a very tricky balance to find, because a lot of our municipalities were building houses for a population that we felt like was already in housing crisis. What to do now if developers pull back, even with low interest rates, because they just don't know what demand's going to look like on the other side of this episode. You should, as a result, be watching for property tax shocks. This is true for California for sure. In the Great Recession, we saw a lot of property tax rolls go down and finally slowly creep back up over almost a decade. Watch for this shock coming if we see a lot of existing units go up and median home prices go down. For a lot of our municipalities also, we're going to be looking at an increase in social assistance, probably more people seeking social assistance than already, and how municipalities are engaged in that and seeing the cost of that, not only to pay for that, even if it's a pass-through from the federal government, but also staffing it, may be very challenging over the next few quarters, if not the next year or so. And then finally, folks, this is one thing about municipalities to watch for, is the unfunded liabilities issue. So we haven't been talking a lot about unfunded liabilities as sort of headline news over the last few years because the stock market has gone up. A lot of cities have sort of got themselves square financially, at least partially, since the Great Recession. And it hasn't been as top of mind. But when these crises hit and equity markets sag, as well as people say, wow, it's been 10 more years and maybe it's time for me to now finally choose to retire, you might see unfunded liabilities suddenly become funded liabilities in the sense that they now have to be paid for. And it might force a creaking again of our pension systems, because if revenues are falling at the same time that expenses are going up because people are choosing to walk away and actually jump into retirement now, that's something to watch. The flip side of that argument is you may see unfunded liabilities actually rise because people stay in their jobs, get to higher levels of retirement by staying another year and accelerating that sort of retirement path, which could exacerbate the unfunded liability situation against downturn revenues. We should expect our pension systems to have some creaking and some concerns over the next 18 months because of what's just happened in the markets the last about 8 weeks. Okay, the election. So let's talk about the fun stuff. Before March 1, we expected Trump to win. Every political scientist I talked to said the Democrats are just posturing for 2024. Trump should win. Well, after March 1, our president's been heavily tested, and we will see on the other side of this how people are looking at him in terms of putting him back in office against Joe Biden. And that's something that, a lot of political scientists are now kind of scratching their heads. We just don't know. If Trump wins, there's likely to be not much change in our economy. So one of the concerns about an election year is that changing the guard in the White House can easily change the outlook of business on the economy. If Trump wins, it should be little effect because we know what we're getting. If the Democrats win, not only would we be coming out of the shadow of this downturn and potentially, having it stick around a little bit, businesses are going to be very concerned about whether or not we're going to see a revision of healthcare to kind of go Obamacare wider and maybe even more toward universal payer and then or single payer, and then finally whether or not we have taxes rise in sort of slow reversal of the tax cuts we saw in the beginning of 2018. So what should we be watching for? So to wrap up, watch for labor market changes, folks. The evolution of those unemployment insurance claims become unemployed workers, which becomes higher unemployment rates, but it's really the duration of those high numbers that should concern you, not the height of them. You're going to see some wacky historic numbers over the next few weeks. It's really the key is how quickly it turns back or how it pops up and pops back down, because the duration of the unemployment insurance claims might be there, but people may not be unemployed. That's why the other two are critical. Are job openings flattening because businesses don't see the other side of the problem yet and the light has not shown at the end of the tunnel? And are they actually working? How many hours are being worked? So you might see some hybrid where people are gaining unemployment insurance benefits but still working, which means average hours worked may dip but not fall precipitously. So the combination of those labor market factors are what I'm watching as an economist to try to decipher where our economy is going and what ultimately might mean business failures because of lack of demand and also just a lack of being able to keep workers around, and ultimately some major issues in our housing markets and for our municipalities. The epidemiology is a parallel line. Until we see the top of that curve, folks, a lot of the social policies are not going to get lifted. So if that curve does not start to top out, or if it starts to rise, we might be even more locked down into the beginning of summer. So we're hoping that the end of April is going to mean the end of the curve rising, at least. And if that's true, we should start to see some places lift the social policies. But the evolution of this in April is going to be a big deal. We'll probably remember April 2020 for a really long time in this country and around the world. And watch the urban areas, folks. If you live in a city, it's critical to watch what happens socially, because it may get very strange in our cities over the next few weeks if people are continuing to be bottled up. So those are the hot spots, not only of the infection rates, but also potential social issues and additional social costs on top of everything else that might happen. If you have any questions, please feel free to contact me in the contact information. But as Vicki said right off the top, we're doing this again next week to update you on whatever new data may be there and some other topics that we may find interesting for you. Again, the evolution of the labor markets is the key, so watch for that. And more stuff is coming from me through Chabon Concepts, so check out Chabon's website and make sure that you get the recording and anything else new that we put up. And folks, after that, I've just taken any questions. So Vicki, I'm now going to unmute you. And if we have questions, that'd be great.
Okay, we have a couple questions. First is, would you expect that distribution, logistics, warehousing type industries to be a bright spot in the economy because of the surge in e-commerce and adjustment from the different inventory levels, the just in time, and those that are stocking up on items that will have to be distributed or stored?
That's a great question. I see it lumbering along, not surging per se, because we're not buying a lot of bigger items that would be distributed. But I think what you're going to see is you're going to see distribution and logistics start to consolidate a little bit around the bigger players, with the idea that once the corner turns, they're going to use their ability to remain in business to consolidate and really set up the next market play. And I think you're going to see a lot more, the gains will be bigger for those businesses on the other side of this. And right now it's just really kind of staying around break even or maybe a little higher than that. Some are doing better than others. Amazon is feeding a lot of those right now. But I think you're going to see bigger gains on the other side of this, where we may be going to a more distribution and logistics economy than we first were going to anyway, naturally, on the other side. Unfortunately, that has a negative aspect in terms of, let's say, downtown and mall-driven retail. If people start to walk away from that and want to use ordered goods that come home because they're concerned about going to a public place, especially in the short to medium term, our downtowns and our malls may have a lot of pressure on them, especially on the commercial real estate side.
Okay, thanks. And so you've kind of addressed the retail, the downtown. How would you expect the impact of this differing supply chain on manufacturing?
Let me say, if I can restate the question a little bit. If the idea is that we think about downtown retail in one bucket, and then we think about manufacturing and how that might evolve on the other one, I actually think manufacturing in the United States, and Vicki, correct me if this is not the right question, might actually get some gains out of this episode for two reasons. I think one is that Congress and the president may be very concerned about a second episode where we don't want to lose supply chains because we're so connected to China and East Asia. So if the supposition is that we're going to see a second episode, again, originating in East Asia, why not think about diversifying manufacturing now in the United States, specifically for pharmaceuticals and for other, let's say, medicines and other healthcare products, rather than be somewhat reliant on other countries for those goods. So we might actually see a swing up of small manufacturing that specializes in goods that would help us in an episode like this that we'd have to wait to get because supply chains otherwise might be choked up. So I kind of see a very small renaissance in manufacturing on the other side of this, at least in the short to medium term. Whether or not that continues in the long is an open question, but I think we're going to actually see some gains in manufacturing, believe it or not, on the other side. I think some other places that are going to suffer a little bit is if you're in the, let's say, higher end furniture, let's say renovation manufacturing where you're doing cabinetry, et cetera, that might be a little slower slog coming out in terms of people not maybe making the choice to make those big purchases.
Okay, good. Do you anticipate the impact to local retail to be permanent?
Yes, unfortunately. I think unfortunately you're going to see, and think of it this way, if you have a business and I take away 8 to 12 weeks of your revenue, how many businesses can really survive under that situation? So if you have businesses that were already on relatively slim margins and then I take your revenue away for which you maybe don't have as much cost, but you don't have any revenue to look at fixed costs and continue to pay them, it's going to make the calculus of staying in business for a lot of local retailers pretty tough. And while the federal stimulus might help, the longer this episode continues, the more pressure on local retailers, especially let's say the local mom and pops, to keep alive on the other side of this scenario. It's going to be very tricky, unfortunately. And that would lead to more permanence around that issue.
So kind of on that same topic, just so that we can kind of look forward and compare, about how quickly did the confidence return after 9/11, after the recession?
That's a great question. Consumer confidence lagged most of the rest of 2001 and also took most of 2009 to turn. And then it came back pretty fast in 2010, 11, and 12. And sort of, we really took off after 2012 in our economy, but it took almost 3.5 years from sort of the bottom of the recession to where we really felt confident we had turned the corner to go. 9/11, it was much more quick. So if you think about it, if we're looking more like the Great Recession than the dot-com recession plus 9/11, it might take a couple of years for consumers to feel super confident about getting back into the markets. Now, what took us a long time, which this time we reacted very quickly, was the pain came, and then 18 months later, we started to get the relief, which took about another 18 months to play out. This time we got that relief within 40 days. So it might be that coming so quick, we're talking about only 18 more months or maybe even 12 for consumers to really start to feel the positive effects of policy and also feel like that we've got around the corner. And folks, a vaccine coming is going to wash away a lot of problems. The issue is that the vaccine may not be coming for 12 or 16 months, which means the second episode is creeping up on more likelihood, unfortunately.
Okay, and what is the state of farm labor availability, and what effect will it have on California's economy?
That's a great question. So one of the things I've been thinking about is, and we're not talking about much, is we're talking about unemployment rates rising and people gaining access to unemployment insurance. There's a lot of workers, specifically in our agricultural ranks, that don't have the availability of unemployment insurance and are basically cash workers. And with border closures, what we don't know is if our border remains relatively sealed, we won't have as natural a flow. I mean, because basically instead of checking everybody, it's just sealed. So the natural flow of workers and then the unnatural flow of workers, if you think about just border crossings that, the United States deems illegal, those workers, when they come in usually during seasonal times. So if you have a more sealed border, in kind of an ironic fashion, the COVID-19 scenario has sort of given Trump an ability to start sealing off the borders. And that may play out negatively, unfortunately, for our farmers come harvest season. And that's from everything from almonds all the way down to wine and everything in between. It's going to be a very tricky thing. And furthermore, which I think is even more tricky, is whether or not it's permanent in its effects. That's, I think, where we're really going to test the waters of how dependent labor, specifically in places like California, but really nationwide, is on a workforce that's undocumented, potentially migrating, and does not have some of these reliefs that Congress and the Federal Reserve are giving easily available to them.
Great, thank you. Okay, so would business interruption insurance make a big difference for small businesses?
There's no doubt about the fact that if you have business continuity / discontinuity insurance and your business is interrupted like this, having that mechanism is a good thing. What we don't know, and this is one of the critical factors that we're going to look at on the other side of this, and probably economists are going to write thousands of papers on this, is what the decision trigger is for your insurance company to pay out. Will this be seen as force majeure or an act of God, and hence I don't have to pay? Or will I pay right up, trying to do the thing for the client that we talked about in the first place? And you're probably going to see a wild mix. So if you're in the insurance industry right now, you're going to have a lot of pressure on you if those kind of policies are something you specialize in. And whether or not federally or at the state level, there's a mandate to pay on those policies, even if the contract language allows you to not have to pay as much or at all, with this being defined legally as an act of God. It's going to be very tricky to watch all that play out, but it certainly will help those that receive the payments. And that's exactly why you bought the insurance, is for an event you could not foresee. But it'll be intriguing to watch how the insurance companies, with so many potential claims happening simultaneously, look for ways of mitigating the risk which is exactly what insurance is all about, and how federal and state policy may force that risk upon them. It's going to be a very tricky environment.
That's going to be interesting to watch.
Yes.
Okay, one more question. The entire U.S. economy, $15 trillion, and Congress passed a historic $2 trillion stimulus. Do you think the stimulus hitting the economy in quarter 3 and 4 of 2020 will lead to a quick bounce back? And what effect will the stimulus have on 2020 and 2021?
It's a great question. So the supposition is that we will start to feel the effects, actually, of the federal stimulus in June, or by June, because it's already going to be coming. I mean, by the end of April, we should start seeing checks show up and the money will be in people's pockets. Now, they may not be able to spend it yet. And so the question may be about, let's assume that we're not through this thing until really July 1, which is the beginning of the third quarter. And it's Q3 and Q4 where we really start to see the effects. There's a lot of forecasts out there that have a very sharp downturn in Q2, and quarter 3 and quarter 4 are very sharp coming back, where by 2021, we're basically around the corner. I think it's going to be a little longer than that. I don't really see consumers jumping in to consumption right away, and it may be into the first or second quarter of 2021 that we really start to see the full effects of this. But there's two aspects to think about. One is that some people who receive the checks may not need the checks and are just going to stick it in savings. They won't necessarily spend it right away. So be watchful of that, that it's not, generally speaking, going to everybody who just needs the help. It's very uniform in its effects by the nature of how we do politics in the United States when we do these kind of payments. The second is, if people are not spending that money, and it really leads to something that's more of like a bridge over troubled water, and the jobs are just simply not there on the other side because they did not have as big a demand surge as we expected. The round in terms of the downturn in jobs and ultimately business pressure to stay in business might again lead into the next few quarters and not just end on July 1. So we're watching very closely to see if those checks showing up in July, August, and September become way more spending than we expected. That's when you'll know we've turned the corner a little bit. But that second episode, maybe coming in the fall, unfortunately, might have people save it and wait if they can, because if they spend it and they don't get another tranche of money, and there's already talking in Congress about doing another 2 rounds, it may be a lot longer time before we see the turn.
Okay, good. I think we have time for this one last question. I have 9:38. And again, those who are listening, if we didn't get your question, if you have more questions or if they come up later, feel free to email them either to Rob, whose email address is on the screen. You can email them to me, Vicki@chabenconcepts.com, and we will add them to our next webinar on April 10 at 8:30 in the morning. So last question, would you anticipate an urban to rural migration?
That's a great question. I don't think so. And in fact, I would see the reverse happening, assuming 2 things. One, that job creation after the destruction is more likely to happen in the urban and suburban areas than the rural areas. And that there's some real estate shock that allows the rural and suburban to move to the urban at a lower cost. I don't see the reverse, except for one possibility, and that is that in the urban areas, there's enough jobs that are portable enough to where people say, okay, I'm now done with the city. I'm going to take whatever wealth I have left, and I'm going to move to a more rural area that may be within commuting distance of the urban area, but because I don't have to commute 5 days a week anymore because we've changed the way we do work, I'm now going to telecommute 2 days a week. So I'm going to go in Monday through Wednesday, and then Thursday, Friday, I'm going to turn into a 4-day weekend at home where I'm working 2 days and not working the other 2 days in a normal weekend. That may be the trigger for urban to rural, but historically speaking, these kind of downturns actually do the reverse. So if we have a change in the way we do work, you might see urban to rural. It's more likely to be rural to urban.
Okay, that's interesting. So, okay, well, I said that was the last question, but there's one more here. Yes,
No
you can register for the 410 webinar.
Oh.
Everybody who has registered for this one should have received the link for the 410. We will send out another notice, and we will have it on our website. So plenty of time to register for 410. We'll have the link out there. Again, I'd like to thank everybody and thank Rob. This has been awesome. We got some good comments. Everybody has really enjoyed your insights.
Thank you, guys. I really appreciate you making the time today. Thank you, Vicki.
All right. Thank you. And we will see you all here next week, 8:30.
Thank you.
Thank you.